April 2019. In this newsletter, I reminded you again. God made 2 covenants with the sons of Israel at Mount Sinai. The first covenant required the perfect obedience of the corporate body and did not provide a means of atonement. If one individual sinned, every member of the corporate body became guilty. The second covenant provided a means of atonement for the individual. If an individual sinned, his sin could be atoned for, through a sacrificial ritual, but the corporate body still remained guilty. I have also explained these things in The Inheritance of the Believer, Volume 1. Then I showed you some of the things that I explain in The Inheritance of the Believer, Volume 1. I told you the purpose of the Mosaic Covenant was to unify the promise, make corporate Israel the heir of the promise, and establish the terms under which God would fulfill the promise. I reminded you that the inheritance of what was promised was conditioned on the collective obedience of corporate Israel. Then I showed you how God made Moses the heir of the promise by cutting off everyone else when the people sinned at Mount Sinai, and how he then made a second covenant with Moses, a covenant in which the people were viewed as members of Moses, a covenant that allowed Moses to hand the promise down to the people once again, by making them corporate Israel and blessing them shortly before he died. I also told you to compare the blessing of Moses, who was the heir of the promise in his day, and the blessing of Jacob, who was the heir of the promise in his day. My point in showing you both the blessing of Moses and the blessing of Jacob was to make the point that both served the same function. In both cases, the heir of the promise was handing down the promise to the next heirs of the promise. I told you the difference is, Jacob divided up the promise and handed down various parts of the promise to his sons. Moses handed down the promise to the tribes of corporate Israel, the heir of the promise. But he did so only after the people ratified yet a third covenant, one in which they became members of the corporate entity rather than members of Moses.